In the winter of 1610, 4 men climbed up to a castle in the mountains of what is now Slovakia, sent by the king himself to investigate a rumor. They were powerful men, not easily shocked, but what they found inside is said to have stopped them at the door. A girl dead on the floor, another still alive, her body torn and burned. And below, in the cellars, more. The mistress of that castle was one of the richest women in the kingdom, a countess from a family so powerful it had produced kings. By the time they were finished counting, the accusations against her would reach a number almost too large to believe. 650 girls. And 500 years later, you don't remember a single one of their names. You remember hers. This is the true story of Elizabeth Báthory, the woman history turned into a vampire, and the far more disturbing truth hiding underneath the legend. She was born in 1560 into the Báthory family, one of the most powerful bloodlines in all of Europe. Her relatives were princes, generals, and the king of Poland. She was raised in unimaginable wealth and absolute privilege, in a world where a noble's word was law and a peasant's life was worth almost nothing. As a child, she was brilliant, educated, fluent in several languages at a time when most nobles could barely read. But she also grew up watching cruelty treated as normal. Servants were property, punishment was public. The gap between those who mattered and those who did not was the deepest law of her world, and no one ever questioned it. At 15, she married a powerful warlord, Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier so feared on the battlefield against the Ottomans that they called him the Black Knight of Hungary. He was away at war for years at a time, and while he was gone, Elizabeth ran their vast network of estates alone. She managed the lands, the money, the politics, and the hundreds of servants who lived and died at her command. She had total power over all of them, and no one above her to answer to. That, it would turn out, was the most dangerous thing of all. The accusations begin quietly, and then they grow into something monstrous. It started, the witnesses said, with the servant girls. A girl who stitched a seam wrong, a girl who stole a coin, a girl who simply displeased her. The punishments were not the ordinary cruelty of the age. They were something else. Beatings that went on for hours, girls stuck with needles and pins, burned with candles and red-hot iron. Some, the testimony claimed, were dragged out into the snow at night and doused with freezing water until they died standing up, frozen solid. Others were starved or mutilated in ways the court records describe in language that is still hard to read 400 years later. And the supply never ran out. Because the victims were poor, they were peasant girls sent willingly by their own desperate families to work for a great lady, an honor, a way out of poverty. When a girl died, the Countess's servants buried her quietly or told the family she had fallen ill or run away. No one investigated. No one came looking. Who would? They were nobodies. For years, that was exactly why she could not be stopped. The system was not broken. The system was working precisely as designed, protecting the powerful and disappearing the poor. But she made one fatal mistake. she got greedy, and she aimed too high. As the years passed, the peasant girls were no longer enough. The Countess opened what was essentially a finishing school, inviting the daughters of the lesser nobility to her castle to learn manners and courtly graces. These girls were not nobodies, and when they began to die too, their families had names and connections and voices that could not simply be ignored. The whispers reached the royal court, and the King of Hungary, Matthias, happened to owe the Báthory family an enormous debt, a fortune in loans her late husband had given the crown. A dead and disgraced countess was a debt that did not have to be repaid. Whatever the truth of the horrors, the king now had every reason in the world to want them believed. On the night of December 30th, 1610, her own cousin, the Lord Palatine, led the raid on Cheta Castle. The trial that followed was swift. Her servants, the ones accused of helping her, were tortured into confession, then executed, their fingers torn off and their bodies burned. More than 300 witnesses testified. One mentioned the private book said to be in the Countess's own hand, listing the names of her victims. 650 of them. The book has never been found, but Elizabeth herself was never put on trial. She was far too powerful, too well connected for a public execution of a bathory. So instead, they made her disappear. They walled her up inside her own castle, bricked into a set of rooms with only a small slot left open to pass food through. No sunlight, no visitors, no trial, no verdict, just silence. She lived like that for almost 4 years, sealed inside stone, before she was found dead one morning in August of 1614. She was buried, and the records were locked away, and for 100 years the story slept. And here is where the legend was born, long after she was dead. Because nowhere in any of the thousands of pages of testimony from her own trial does anyone say the thing you have probably already heard, that she bathed in the blood of virgins to stay young. That detail does not exist in the records. It was invented more than a century later by writers who took a real and brutal aristocrat and turned her into a fairy tale. A beautiful vampire countess draining maidens to preserve her beauty. It is a far more thrilling story than the truth, and that is exactly the problem. The bloodbath myth made her immortal, a horror movie monster, a Halloween costume. And in doing so, it quietly erased what actually happened. The needles, the freezing, the starvation, the slow, ordinary, industrial cruelty of a powerful person who discovered she could hurt the powerless and never be made to pay. Strip away the vampire, and what's left is something far more modern and far more uncomfortable. Not a supernatural fiend, but a person with absolute power over others, and no one willing to hold her accountable because of who she was and who they were. She was finally stopped in the end, not because girls were dying. Girls had been dying for years. She was stopped the moment she started killing people who counted. That is not a story about a monster from a darker age. That is a story about how power protects itself and whose suffering we decide is worth noticing. We turned her into a vampire because it's easier. A vampire is a fantasy. A fantasy can't happen to you. But she was real, and the 650 were real too. We just never bothered to learn their names. We remember the Countess. We forgot the girls. And that, in the end, was the whole point.